Inside a cold Seattle courtroom, a man sat like a king, about to claim his final victory. Mark didn't just want a divorce, he wanted to erase her. The woman across the aisle, Sarah, wore a plain dress and carried nothing but silence. He had called her a penniless orphan, a mistake he had married out of pity. But Mark never asked the right questions. He never wondered why she smiled when he boasted, or why she never begged. Because Sarah had been waiting for him to show her who he really was. And today, the doors would open, and a man forged in war would walk in with a dog trained to hunt monsters. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. The courtroom smelled of old wood and tension, the kind of tension that lives in the walls of places where lives are split in half and futures are decided by strangers in black robes. The air was cold, not from the temperature, but from the weight of what was about to happen. Outside, rain hammered against the tall windows, streaking the glass like tears the building had cried 1,000 times before. Seattle in November was unforgiving. The sky was a bruised gray, heavy and low, pressing down on the city like a hand that refused to let go. Inside courtroom number 7, the fluorescent lights hummed quietly, casting a pale, clinical glow over the polished benches and the American flag that hung motionless in the corner. The room was not large, but it felt vast in its silence. Every sound, every shuffle of paper, every clearing of a throat echoed like a confession. At the front of the room sat Judge Harold Brennan, a man in his late 60s with silver hair and deep-set eyes that had seen too many lies to be fooled easily. He reviewed a thick file in front of him, his reading glasses perched low on his nose, his expression unreadable. He had presided over hundreds of divorce cases. Most of them were sad. Some of them were bitter. A few were cruel. This one, he suspected, was going to be all three. To the left, near the aisle, sat Mark Calloway. He was 42 years old, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people earned in a month. His dark hair was slicked back with precision, his jaw clean-shaven, his cologne expensive and sharp. He sat with his legs crossed, one arm draped casually over the back of the bench, his lips curved into a faint, arrogant smile. Beside him were two lawyers, both men in their 50s, both wearing expressions of quiet confidence. They had been paid very well to win this case, and they intended to deliver. Mark leaned toward the younger of the two lawyers and whispered something. The lawyer smirked and nodded. Mark's smile widened. He glanced across the aisle, and his eyes landed on the woman sitting alone on the other side. Sarah Calloway, soon to be Sarah Donovan again, if Mark had his way, sat with her hands folded in her lap. She was 36 years old, slender, with long chestnut hair pulled back into a simple braid. She wore a pale blue dress, modest and unremarkable, the kind of dress that wouldn't draw a second glance. No jewelry, no makeup, beyond a touch of something natural. Her face was calm, her eyes steady, her posture composed. She looked like someone who had already accepted defeat. Mark saw that composure and mistook it for weakness. He whispered again to his lawyer, louder this time, just loud enough for Sarah to hear. "Look at her. She's got nothing. No lawyer, no fight. This is going to be over in 10 minutes. The lawyer chuckled softly and adjusted his tie. Sarah didn't react. She didn't flinch. She didn't look at him. She simply sat, her gaze fixed on the empty judge's bench, her breathing slow and even. Inside, though, her heart was a war drum. Not from fear, from anticipation. Because Sarah knew something that Mark did not. She knew that in exactly 4 minutes, the doors at the back of the courtroom were going to open. And when they did, everything Mark believed about power, control, and dominance was going to shatter like glass under a boot. The bailiff, a stocky man in his 50s with a gray mustache, stood near the side door and glanced at his watch. He cleared his throat, preparing to announce the start of the proceedings when the judge raised one hand slightly, a gesture that said, "Wait." Judge Brennan's eyes flicked toward the back of the room. He had been informed, just minutes before entering, that there would be a late arrival, someone with military clearance. Someone whose presence had been requested under unusual circumstances. Mark noticed the judge's pause and frowned. "What's the holdup?" he muttered. One of his lawyers leaned in. "Not sure. Probably some clerk running late." Mark shook his head, annoyed. "Typical. Let's just get this done. I've got a lunch meeting at 1. Sarah's lips twitched. Not quite a smile. Just the faintest ghost of one. The rain outside grew louder. Thunder rumbled low and distant, a warning that rolled across the city like a drumbeat before battle. And then the doors opened. Not slowly, not quietly. They swung inward with a heavy, deliberate force, and the sound echoed through the courtroom like a gavel strike. Every head turned. The man who entered was not tall, just under 6 feet, but he filled the space like a storm front moving inland. He wore dark tactical pants, a black jacket zipped halfway, and boots that struck the tile floor with the kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. His face was hard, weathered by sun and sand and sleepless nights, in places most people only saw on the news. His hair was cut military short, dark brown with flecks of gray at the temples. His eyes were pale blue, sharp as broken ice, and they swept the room in a single, assessing glance. Beside him, moving in perfect sync, was a German shepherd. The dog was massive, 85 pounds of muscle, black and tan coat gleaming even under the dull courtroom lights. His ears were erect, his gaze locked forward, his posture disciplined and alert. He wore a tactical harness with a small American flag patch on one side, and the letters K9 Unit stitched across the back. His name was Rex, and he had saved lives in 3 different countries. The man's name was Jack Donovan, and he had ended threats in more countries than that. Jack stopped just inside the doorway, his hand resting lightly on Rex's back. The dog sat immediately, his tail still, his eyes trained on the room. Jack's gaze moved across the benches, the judge, the lawyers, and then it landed on Mark. Mark's smile faltered. Jack's expression didn't change. He simply looked at Mark the way a hunter looks at something that's already been marked. Then Jack's eyes shifted to Sarah. For the first time since entering the courtroom, his face softened. Just slightly. Just enough. Sarah met his gaze and nodded once. A small, steady gesture that said, "I'm okay. I'm still here." Jack nodded back. Then he turned toward the judge, his movements calm and deliberate, and began walking down the aisle. Rex moved with him, silent and fluid, his claws clicking softly against the floor. Every person in that room watched them. The bailiff straightened. The court reporter paused mid-keystroke. Even Mark's lawyers sat a little straighter. Judge Brennan looked up from his file, and his expression shifted not with surprise, but with recognition. He had been told who was coming. He had read the name on the document. But seeing Jack Donovan in person was different. Jack reached the front of the room and stopped just behind Sarah's bench. He didn't sit. He stood, one hand still resting on Rex's shoulders, his presence a wall between Sarah and everything that had tried to break her. Mark stared. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. He glanced at his lawyers, but they looked just as confused. "Who the hell is that?" Mark hissed under his breath. His lead lawyer shook his head slowly. I don't know." Judge Brennan set down his file and removed his glasses. He looked directly at Jack. "Lieutenant Commander Donovan." Jack nodded. "Your Honor. You've been cleared to present evidence in this matter." "Yes, sir." Mark shot to his feet. "Wait, what? What evidence? This is a divorce hearing, not a criminal trial. Who is this guy?" Judge Brennan's gaze shifted to Mark, cold and level. "Sit down, Mr. Calloway. I have a right to know." "Sit down." Mark sat. His face was red now, his confidence cracking. "If you believe that real courage doesn't wait for permission and that the truth should never bow to arrogance, tap the like button." Jack reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim, black folder. He handed it directly to the bailiff, who carried it to the judge. Rex remained seated, his eyes never leaving Mark. Judge Brennan opened the folder. His eyes moved across the first page, then the second. His jaw tightened. Mark's lead lawyer stood. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a recess to review whatever this is." "Request denied," the judge said quietly. He looked up at Jack. "This is authenticated?" "Yes, sir. Chain of custody is clean. Digital forensics verified. DOD legal approved the release under judicial subpoena." Mark's heart was pounding now. He didn't understand what was happening, but he understood the tone in the room. It had shifted. The air had changed. The smirk was gone from his lawyers' faces. Judge Brennan turned a page, then another. He exhaled slowly, a sound that carried more weight than words. "Mr. Calloway," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "do you know what this is?" Mark swallowed. "No." "This," the judge said, lifting the folder slightly, "is a forensic financial audit, conducted by a third-party firm with federal clearance. It details the ownership structure of Calloway Enterprises, the company you claim to have built from the ground up." Mark's face went pale. That's my company." "No," Judge Brennan said, his voice like iron. "It's not." Silence. Mark's breathing quickened. His hands gripped the edge of the table. The judge continued. "According to this audit, 73% of Calloway Enterprises is owned by a holding company called Donovan Legacy Trust. That trust was established 22 years ago by the late Admiral Theodore Donovan and his wife Catherine Donovan. Upon their deaths, the trust transferred to their 2 surviving children." Mark's mouth went dry. "The primary beneficiary," Judge Brennan said slowly, his eyes lifting to meet Sarah's, "is Sarah Marie Donovan Calloway. The secondary trustee and executor is Lieutenant Commander Jack Thomas Donovan." The room seemed to tilt. Mark turned in his seat, staring at Sarah. She hadn't moved. She hadn't spoken. But her eyes, those calm, steady eyes, were no longer the eyes of someone defeated. They were the eyes of someone who had been waiting for this moment for 5 long years. "You," Mark's voice was a hoarse whisper, "you own my company?" Sarah didn't answer. She didn't need to. Jack's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "She doesn't just own it, Calloway. She funded it. Every dollar you used to start that business came from the trust she inherited. You signed documents. You used her credit. You built your empire on her foundation. And the whole time, you called her worthless." Mark's lawyer stood again, his face flushed. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." "Sit down, counselor," the judge said sharply. "You'll have your chance." But the lawyer knew. They all knew. The case was over. Judge Brennan flipped another page. His expression darkened further. "There's more." This audit also uncovered evidence of financial misconduct, falsified tax documents, offshore accounts. Shell companies used to hide assets during the marriage. Mr. Calloway, you came into this court seeking to leave your wife with nothing, but you did so using funds that were never yours to begin with. Mark's chest was heaving now. His hands trembled. He looked at Sarah, desperation creeping into his voice. "Sarah, we can fix this. We can work this out. You don't have to." "Stop." The word came from Sarah. Quiet, firm, final. She stood slowly, and for the first time since the hearing began, she looked directly at Mark. "I loved you," she said, her voice steady but laced with something raw. "I loved you enough to hide who I was, to live simply, to let you think you were the strong one, the provider, the one in control. I wanted to see if you could love me for me. Not for my name, not for my money, just me." Mark opened his mouth, but no words came. "And you couldn't," Sarah continued. "You mocked me. You belittled me. You told people I was nothing. You brought me here today to humiliate me one last time." Her voice didn't waver. "So yes, Mark, we're done, but not the way you planned." If you've ever watched someone mistake kindness for weakness, type justice in the comments. Judge Brennan closed the folder and set it down with a decisive thud. Mr. Calloway, based on the evidence presented, I am issuing the following orders. All marital assets acquired during the marriage are to be frozen pending further investigation. Mrs. Calloway is to retain full ownership and control of Donovan Legacy Trust and all associated holdings. You are hereby ordered to vacate the marital residence within 72 hours. You will be allowed to take personal clothing and effects only. All vehicles, properties, and financial accounts tied to the trust are to be returned to Mrs. Calloway's control immediately. Mark's face was white. You can't do this. I just did. The judge looked at Jack. Lieutenant Commander, thank you for your service to this court. And to your sister. Jack nodded once. Thank you, Your Honor. Judge Brennan stood. This hearing is adjourned. The gavel came down. And with it, Mark's world shattered. If the system finally worked the way it should, and someone who tried to bury the truth got exposed instead, share this with someone who needs to see it. The courtroom emptied slowly. Mark sat frozen in his seat, staring at nothing. His lawyers gathered their briefcase in silence, avoiding his gaze. One of them muttered something about appeals, but even he didn't sound convinced. Sarah stood and smoothed her dress. She picked up a small purse from beneath the bench, a purse that had been there the whole time, containing nothing but her ID and a single photograph of her parents. Jack stepped beside her. Rex stood as well, his tail giving one slow, deliberate wag. You okay? Jack asked quietly. Sarah nodded. I am now. They walked toward the back of the courtroom together. Sarah's steps were steady. Jack's presence was a shield. Rex walked between them, his ears swiveling, still alert, still on duty. As they reached the doors, Sarah paused. She turned and looked back at Mark one last time. He was still sitting there, slumped forward, his hands covering his face. She felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just relief. She turned away and walked out into the hallway. The rain had stopped. Through the tall windows at the end of the corridor, pale sunlight was breaking through the clouds, casting long golden beams across the marble floor. Jack glanced at her. You hungry? Sarah smiled. A real smile this time. Starving. Good, I know a place. Rex likes their burgers. She laughed softly, and the sound echoed down the empty hallway like a bell ringing after a storm. They pushed through the main doors and stepped outside. The air was cold and clean, washed by the rain. The streets glistened. The city smelled like wet pavement and pine. Sarah took a deep breath and closed her eyes. Freedom, she thought, tastes like this. Jack put a hand on her shoulder. You did good in there. I didn't do anything. You did. No, Jack said firmly. You stood up. You stayed calm. You waited for the right moment. That's strength, Sarah. That's courage. She looked at him, her eyes glistening. I missed you. I missed you too. Rex nudged her hand with his nose. She reached down and scratched behind his ears. He leaned into her touch, his tail wagging in slow, satisfied sweeps. Good boy, she whispered. Good boy, Rex. They started walking down the courthouse steps. A few people passed by, lawyers, clerks, citizens caught in the machinery of the system. None of them knew what had just happened in Courtroom 7. None of them knew that a woman had walked in labeled worthless and walked out owning an empire. But Sarah knew. And that was enough. Stay tuned. The battle in the courtroom is over, but the reckoning is just beginning. 3 days later, the penthouse was empty. Sarah stood in the center of the living room, her arms crossed, her eyes scanning the space that had once been her prison. The furniture was gone. The art was gone. The Persian rugs, the crystal chandelier, the leather couches, gone. Mark had taken nothing, because none of it had ever been his. The walls were bare, the windows were streaked with rain, the whole place felt hollow, like a shell left behind after something had crawled out and died. Jack stood near the window, hands in his pockets, Rex sitting calmly beside him. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked. Sarah looked around. "Sell it, or donate it, I don't care. I never liked this place anyway. Why'd you stay?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because I needed to know. I needed to see who he really was. And I needed to see who I really was." Jack turned to look at her. "And?" "I'm stronger than I thought." He smiled. "Yeah, you are." She walked over to the window and stood beside him. Together, they looked out over the city. The skyline stretched out in shades of gray and silver, the Space Needle rising like a sentinel in the distance. "You ever think about what Dad would say?" Sarah asked softly. Jack nodded. "Every day. He'd be proud of you. He'd be proud of both of us." Sarah's throat tightened. She hadn't cried in the courtroom. She hadn't cried when Mark begged. But here, standing in the ruins of a life she'd left behind, the tears finally came. Jack put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, her brother, her protector, her family. Rex stood and pressed his body against her legs, a warm, solid presence. They stood like that for a long time, the three of them, in the silence of a place that no longer held any power. When the tears stopped, Sarah wiped her face and took a breath. "Okay," she said. "Let's go." "Where to?" "Home." Jack raised an eyebrow. "You still have the cabin?" "I never sold it." "Good," Jack said. "That's where you belong." They left the penthouse and didn't look back. The cabin was 2 hours north of Seattle, nestled in the woods near a lake that reflected the sky like a mirror. It was small, built of cedar and stone, with a wraparound porch and a chimney that puffed smoke into the cold air. It had belonged to their parents. It had been the only place Sarah ever felt truly safe. When they arrived, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The air smelled like pine and wood smoke. The lake was still, undisturbed, a sheet of glass holding the last light of the day. Sarah stood on the porch and looked out at the water. Jack was inside, building a fire. Rex was exploring the yard, sniffing every tree and rock with the focus of a soldier on patrol. She heard the crackle of the fire starting, the warmth beginning to spread through the cabin. She heard Jack moving around, finding blankets, setting up the old coffee pot. And for the first time in 5 years, she felt like she could breathe. What do you think true wealth really is, money? Or the people who stand with you when everything else is stripped away? Comment below. That night, they sat by the fire. Sarah wrapped in a thick blanket, Jack in an old flannel shirt. Rex stretched out on the rug between them, his eyes half closed, his breathing deep and even. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Sometimes silence is the only language that tells the whole truth. After a while, Sarah spoke. "Thank you." Jack glanced at her. "For what?" "For coming back. For being there. For everything." "You're my sister," Jack said simply. "There's nowhere else I'd be." She smiled. "Mom and Dad raised you right. They raised both of us right." Sarah looked into the fire, watching the flames dance and twist. "Do you ever wonder if they're watching?" "Every day," Jack said, "and I think they're smiling." She nodded. "Yeah, me too." Rex stirred, lifted his head, and looked at Jack. Jack reached down and scratched the dog's ears. "You did good too, buddy." Rex's tail thumped once against the floor. Sarah laughed softly. "He's a good boy." "The best," Jack agreed. They sat in the warmth of the fire, the three of them, a family forged not by blood alone, but by loyalty, sacrifice, and love. Outside, the stars came out one by one, piercing the darkness like promises. Mark Calloway stood on a street corner in downtown Seattle, holding a duffel bag and a bus ticket to Spokane. The penthouse was gone. The cars were gone. The bank accounts were frozen. His lawyers had dropped him the moment the judge's ruling went public. His business partners had distanced themselves. His so-called friends had stopped returning his calls. He had nothing. He had become the very thing he had once mocked. He looked down at the ticket in his hand. One way. Economy. No return. The rain started again, light at first, then harder. He didn't have an umbrella. He didn't have a coat. He just stood there, getting soaked, staring at the name on the ticket. Mark Calloway. He barely recognized it anymore. A bus pulled up to the curb, its brakes hissing, its headlights cutting through the rain. The driver opened the door and looked at him. "You getting on or not?" Mark climbed aboard. The bus was half empty. He found a seat near the back, dropped his bag on the floor, and stared out the window as the bus pulled away from the curb. Seattle blurred past him. The lights, the buildings, the life he thought he owned. All of it. Gone. He closed his eyes and tried not to think about the woman with the calm eyes and the simple dress. The woman who had been a queen the whole time, and he had never even noticed. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the boardroom of Calloway Enterprises, renamed Donovan Industries. The room was filled with executives, investors, and advisors. The company had been restructured, cleaned of corruption, and rebranded. Under Sarah's leadership, it was thriving. She wore a sharp navy suit, her hair pulled back, her expression confident and composed. She had stepped into her role not with arrogance, but with quiet authority. At the end of the meeting, one of the board members approached her. "Mrs. Donovan." "Miss Donovan," she corrected gently. "Miss Donovan, I just wanted to say you've done an incredible job. Your father would be very proud." Sarah's chest tightened, but she smiled. "Thank you. That means a lot." As the room emptied, she stood by the window, looking out over the city. Jack had gone back overseas. Another mission, another war, but they talked every week, and Rex was with him, as always. She missed them, but she knew they were doing what they were meant to do, just like she was. She pulled out her phone and sent Jack a message. "Closed a deal today. Dad's company is back on track. Wish you were here." A few minutes later, her phone buzzed. "Proud of you, sis," Rex says, "Woof. Stay strong. Love you." She smiled, slipped the phone back into her pocket, and walked out of the boardroom. Her heels clicked softly on the polished floor. She was no longer the woman who sat silently in a courtroom, waiting for justice. She was the woman who built it. 1 year after the trial, Sarah received a letter. It was postmarked from Spokane. No return address, just her name, handwritten on the envelope. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was shaky, uncertain. "Sarah, I don't know if you'll read this. I don't know if I deserve for you to. I've spent the last year trying to understand what I did, trying to figure out how I became the person I was in that courtroom. I was cruel. I was arrogant. I was blind. You gave me everything, and I saw nothing. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't expect it. I just wanted you to know that I see it now. I see what I lost, and I see what you always were. I hope you're happy. I hope you're free. You deserve both. Mark." Sarah read the letter twice. Then she folded it, placed it back in the envelope, and set it on the table. She didn't feel anger. She didn't feel pity. She felt closure. She walked to the window of her cabin, looked out at the lake, and let the letter go from her mind. Some chapters close quietly, and that's okay. 2 years later, Jack came home. Not for a visit. For good. He stood on the porch of the cabin, duffel bag over his shoulder, Rex at his side, and knocked on the door. Sarah opened it, and her face lit up like sunrise. "You're back." "I'm back." She threw her arms around him, and he held her tight. "For how long?" she asked. "For good," Jack said. "I'm done. I've served my time. Now I want to be here, with you." Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling. "I'm so glad." Rex barked once, and Sarah laughed, bending down to hug the dog. "I missed you too, buddy." They went inside. The fire was already lit. The cabin smelled like cedar and coffee and home. They sat together, the way they had 100 times before, and talked late into the night. About the past, about the future, about everything in between. And when the conversation finally quieted, Sarah looked at her brother and said, "Thank you for everything." Jack shook his head. "You don't have to thank me." "Yes," she said softly. "I do. You saved me." "No," Jack said, his voice steady and sure. "You saved yourself. I just stood beside you." She smiled. "Then thank you for standing." "Always," Jack said. "Always." Rex, curled up by the fire, let out a long, contented sigh. Outside, the stars burned bright and endless. Inside, a family was whole again. 3 years after the trial, Sarah stood at the edge of the lake behind the cabin, watching the sun rise over the water. The air was crisp, the sky painted in shades of lavender and gold. The world was still and quiet, the kind of quiet that feels sacred. She had changed in those 3 years. Not in the way people change when they break and rebuild. She had changed the way a seed changes when it finally finds the right soil. She had grown into herself, into the woman her parents had always believed she could be. Donovan Industries was now one of the most respected companies in the Pacific Northwest. Under her leadership, it had expanded into renewable energy, veteran support programs, and community development. She had hired people who had been overlooked. She had funded scholarships for kids who looked like her kids who had lost parents too soon, kids who needed someone to believe in them. She didn't do it for recognition. She did it because it was right. Jack had settled into a new life as well. He worked as a consultant for private security firms, training dogs and handlers for search and rescue operations. He spent his weekends at the cabin, hiking with Rex, fishing on the lake, and helping Sarah with projects around the property. He was quieter now. The war had left its marks, but he carried them with dignity. Rex, now 9 years old, had slowed down just a little. His muzzle was flecked with gray, and he preferred long naps by the fire to intense patrols. But his eyes were still sharp, and his loyalty was still absolute. He followed Jack everywhere, a shadow made of fur and devotion. The 3 of them had become a unit, a small, unshakable family. Sarah turned away from the lake and walked back toward the cabin. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from the open door. Jack was up, as always, before dawn. She heard him moving around inside, the clatter of a pan, the hiss of bacon on the stove. She stepped onto the porch, and Rex appeared in the doorway, tail wagging slowly. She scratched his head. "Morning, big guy." Rex leaned into her hand, his eyes closing in contentment. Inside, Jack stood at the stove, flipping bacon with one hand and holding a mug of coffee in the other. He glanced over his shoulder. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," Sarah said, pouring herself a cup. "Too much on my mind." "Good things or bad things?" "Good things," she said, "mostly." Jack nodded. "That's progress." They ate breakfast on the porch, watching the light spread across the valley. The mountains in the distance were capped with snow, sharp and proud against the brightening sky. "I got a call yesterday," Sarah said after a while. Jack looked at her. "Yeah?" "From a lawyer in Spokane." Jack's expression shifted slightly. "Mark?" Sarah nodded. "He's sick. Liver failure. He's in hospice." Jack didn't say anything for a moment. Then he asked, "What did they want?" "They asked if I'd be willing to see him. He's asking for me." Jack set down his coffee. "You don't owe him anything, Sarah." "I know." "So, what are you going to do?" She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I don't know." 2 days later, Sarah drove to Spokane. Jack had offered to come with her, but she told him she needed to do this alone. He didn't argue. He just hugged her, made her promise to call if she needed him, and watched her drive away. The hospice facility was small and clean, tucked into a quiet neighborhood lined with trees. Sarah parked in the lot and sat in her car for a few minutes, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't angry. She just didn't know what she was supposed to feel. Finally, she got out of the car and walked inside. The receptionist directed her to room 12. Sarah walked down the hallway slowly, her footsteps soft on the linoleum floor. The air smelled like antiseptic and something floral lilies, maybe. She stopped outside the door and took a breath. Then she knocked softly and stepped inside. Mark was lying in the bed, propped up slightly by pillows. He looked nothing like the man who had sat arrogantly in that courtroom 3 years ago. His face was gaunt, his skin pale and papery. His hair was thin and gray. His hands, resting on top of the blanket, were frail and trembling. But his eyes, those eyes were still aware, still present. He turned his head slowly and looked at her. "Sarah," he whispered. His voice was hoarse, barely audible. She stood near the door, her arms at her sides. "Hello, Mark." "You came." "I did." He closed his eyes for a moment, as if the weight of her presence was too much. When he opened them again, they were wet. "I didn't think you would." "I almost didn't." He nodded weakly. "I wouldn't have blamed you." She walked closer, but not too close. She stood at the foot of the bed, her hands folded in front of her. "Why did you want to see me?" Mark's breath rattled in his chest. "Because I'm dying, and I didn't want to die without telling you the truth." "What truth?" "That I was wrong." His voice broke. "That I was cruel. That I wasted the best thing I ever had because I was too arrogant to see it." Sarah didn't respond. She just watched him. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Mark continued, his words slow and labored. "I don't deserve it. I needed you to know that I see it now. I see what I did, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Tears slid down his hollow cheeks. Sarah felt something shift inside her. Not forgiveness, exactly, but something close, something softer. "I spent a long time hating you," she said quietly, "but I don't anymore. I don't hate you, Mark. I'm free of you." He nodded, his lips trembling. "That's all I wanted, for you to be free." She stood there a moment longer, looking at the broken man in the bed, the man who had once tried to destroy her, the man who had learned, too late, what really mattered. "I hope you find peace," Sarah said softly. Mark's eyes closed. "Thank you." She turned and walked out of the room. She didn't look back. When she stepped outside into the cold air, she felt lighter. As if something she'd been carrying, something she didn't even know was there, had finally been set down. She got into her car, started the engine, and drove home. Mark Calloway passed away 4 days later. Sarah received the news in a brief phone call from the hospice. She thanked them, hung up, and sat quietly on the porch for a while. Jack came out and sat beside her. "You okay?" "Yeah," she said. "I think I am." "You did a good thing going to see him." "I didn't do it for him," Sarah said. "I did it for me." Jack nodded. "That's the right reason." They sat in silence, watching the sky change colors as the sun set behind the mountains. Rex wandered over and rested his head on Sarah's knee. She stroked his fur gently, rhythmically, the way you touch something precious. "I don't regret anything," Sarah said after a while. "Not the marriage, not the pain, not even the trial. It all led me here." "And where's here?" Jack asked. She smiled. "Home." 5 years after the trial, Sarah Donovan stood on a stage in front of 500 people. She was the keynote speaker at a national conference for women in business. The room was filled with entrepreneurs, executives, students, and survivors. Women who had built something from nothing, who had fought their way through systems designed to keep them out. Sarah wore a simple black dress and a silver necklace her mother had given her years ago. Her hair was down, her posture confident, her voice steady. "I used to think strength meant never breaking," she said into the microphone. "I used to think that if I stayed quiet, if I stayed small, I could survive anything. But I was wrong." The room was silent, every eye on her. "Real strength," Sarah continued, "is knowing when to stand up. It's knowing your worth even when the world tells you you have none. It's walking into a room full of people who underestimate you and proving them wrong, not with anger, but with truth." Applause rippled through the audience. I was married to a man who tried to erase me, who told me I was nothing, who brought me into a courtroom and tried to take everything I had." She paused. "But he couldn't, because what I had wasn't something he could see. It was something I carried inside. My name, my history, my family, my strength." The applause grew louder. "And when the doors opened, and my brother walked in, a Navy SEAL who had fought wars on the other side of the world, I wasn't saved by him. I was reminded of who I already was. I was reminded that I come from warriors, that I am a warrior." The crowd stood. The applause was thunderous. Sarah smiled, tears in her eyes, her heart full. "So to every woman in this room who has ever been told she's not enough, you are. To every woman who has been silenced, speak. To every woman who has been underestimated, rise." The room erupted. Sarah stepped back from the microphone, her hands trembling, her chest tight with emotion. She had done it. She had told her story, and in doing so, she had given others permission to tell theirs. Backstage, Jack was waiting. Rex sat beside him, tail wagging. Sarah walked off the stage and straight into her brother's arms. "You killed it," Jack said, his voice thick. "I couldn't have done it without you." "Yes," Jack said, pulling back to look at her. "You could have, but I'm glad I was here." Rex barked once, and Sarah laughed, bending down to hug him. "You too, buddy. You too." 7 years after the trial, Sarah stood in the same courtroom where it had all happened. But this time, she wasn't a defendant. She was a witness. She had been called to testify in a case involving corporate fraud, a case eerily similar to her own. A woman was being gaslit, manipulated, and financially abused by her spouse. Sarah's testimony was critical. Her story was evidence that justice could be done. She walked to the witness stand, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. The lawyer for the plaintiff, a young woman with fire in her eyes, asked Sarah to recount her experience. Sarah did. She told the whole story: the manipulation, the courtroom, the evidence, the moment the doors opened and her brother walked in. The jury listened, rapt. The opposing lawyer tried to discredit her, tried to suggest that her case was different, that it didn't apply. But Sarah didn't waver. She looked the lawyer in the eye and said, "Abuse is abuse. Theft is theft. And the truth is the truth, no matter how you dress it up." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They found in favor of the plaintiff. The woman, whose name was Emily, broke down in tears. Sarah walked over to her and held her as she cried. "You're free now," Sarah whispered. "You're free." Emily looked up at her, her face streaked with tears. Thank you for being brave." Sarah shook her head. "You're the one who's brave. I just told the truth." 10 years after the trial, Sarah stood on the porch of the cabin, watching the sunset. Jack was inside, cooking dinner. Rex, now 12 years old, gray-faced and slow but still loyal, was asleep by the fire. Sarah's phone buzzed, a text from one of her employees. "Ma'am, the new veteran housing project just got final approval. Ground breaks next month." Sarah smiled and typed back, "Excellent. Let's make it happen." She slipped the phone into her pocket and looked out at the lake. It had been a long road, a hard road, but it had been worth it. She had taken the pain, the betrayal, the darkness, and she had turned it into something good. She had built a life, a legacy, a family, and she had done it on her own terms. Jack stepped onto the porch, wiping his hands on a towel. "Dinner's ready." "Good," Sarah said. "I'm starving." They went inside together. The cabin was warm. The fire crackled. Rex lifted his head and wagged his tail slowly. They sat down at the table, simple food, simple conversation, simple love. And in that simplicity, there was everything. 15 years after the trial, Sarah Donovan passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 71. She was surrounded by family Jack, now in his late 70s, and a house full of nieces, nephews, and friends who had become family. Her funeral was held at the cabin. Hundreds of people came, business leaders, veterans, women she had mentored, people whose lives she had changed. Jack gave the eulogy. "My sister," he said, his voice strong despite his age, "was the bravest person I ever knew. Not because she went to war, not because she fought with weapons, but because she fought with truth, with dignity, with love." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. She walked into a courtroom with nothing, and she walked out with everything. Not because of money, not because of power, but because she knew who she was, and she never let anyone take that away. He looked down at Rex's old collar, which he held in his hands, a keepsake from the dog who had passed 2 years earlier. "She taught me that strength isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up, every single time." The crowd was silent. "So, if you want to honor my sister," Jack said, his voice breaking just slightly, "live like she did. Stand up, speak truth, love fiercely, and never ever let anyone tell you you're not enough." He stepped down from the podium, and the people stood and applauded. Not because she was gone, but because she had lived. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who believes that faith still lives in ordinary days. Leave a comment about the blessings you've witnessed in your own life. And subscribe for more stories that remind us we are never too lost to be found again. May God bless you, keep you warm in your winters, and fill your home with the quiet, steady light of hope.